Hey Artnerds! So today we're going to be using Faber-Castell Durer watercolor markers, Pip Pins, and Polychromos pencils on Strathmore tone tanned paper to create a beautiful mixed media illustration. So these are the materials that I've used to ink my illustration, and you guys might notice I have really faint pink lines printed out onto my toned paper. I have a tutorial for how to print blue lines onto the paper of your choice, and the process is very similar. If you guys need any further walkthrough after watching that video, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. I'm happy to help. So I'm using Strathmore's Tone Tan Mixed Media paper, the Sanguine set of Pip Pins, as well as a few additional Pip Pins in dark sepia as well as in black. So you can see my pink lines here. They're going to be a little bit difficult to see while I'm inking this piece, so just kind of keep them in mind throughout this video. So this is the Pip Pin set I'm using. It contains a small, a fine, a medium, and then a brush. I'm also using a brush and a fine in sepia and a brush and a fine in black because I'm going to be doing colored line art for this illustration. So Tone Tan Mixed Media paper is a heavier mixed media paper made by Strathmore, and I love this paper because it provides a mid-tone for color. So what I'm doing now is I'm inking Kara. First I'm inking her face using the small and the fine for her mouth and her nose. Then I'm using the brush to ink the hair and the rest of the details. Now later on in this piece you will see that I end up doing some re-inking, and that's just to kind of tie the colors together. And I'm working on this piece by piece, rotating it as I go along. And I apologize for the yowling in the background. Bowie decides every single time I start recording that he needs to be in my face talking to me. I think he gets jealous of you guys. So I've pulled the camera in a little bit closer for you guys to see, and unfortunately one of the downsides to inking is that my hand is covering what I'm doing, so you can't see exactly what's going on. But if you're looking for a brush pen inking tutorial, I have several here on this channel, as well as some time-lapse videos where you can see how I handle a brush pen a bit better. So I'll make sure to link those in the description below, as well as in the cards. I also want you guys to keep an eye out for my Durer watercolor marker unbox and swatch, although I did do the unboxing and swatching on a Faber-Castell stream that I'll also link down in the description below. But I wanted to kind of go into these markers in more detail since I've learned some things since I first received my set. I also have information about Pip Pins that I'm going to link in the description below from my blog and from prior videos. There's all sorts of cool techniques you can use for Pip Pins. They are not just limited to inking, so I hope you guys will check those out. So I'm switching back over to a small fixed width, probably it's the fine tip, to add additional details to Kara's inks and to ink her hand. And something cool about the Pip Pin brush pens is if your brush nib starts to get kind of frayed, starts to get kind of chewed up, you can use a pair of tweezers to remove the tip. Don't be shy, just pull it out, turn it over, put it back in, and you've got a fresh new brush tip. We tried this out on the stream, and I have to admit I was really impressed with the results. I didn't think it would work that well. So now I'm using the black Pip Pin to ink Naomi's hair. And if you guys are not familiar with these characters, they are the two main characters from my webcomic, 7-Inch Kara, which you guys can read the first 5 chapters for free at 7inchkara.com or 7inchkara.tumblr.com. We're currently running guest comics because we're preparing for a Kickstarter. Chapters 6, 7, 8, and the bonus Naomi chapter, all of which have never been seen, as well as Chapter 5, which is up as part of the webcomic. I am combining those into a second volume, and that's going to be announced really soon, so I want you guys to keep an eye out for it. I've been working so hard to get it prepared. I'm so excited to share it with you guys. So now that I'm inking something slightly larger, i.e. Naomi, I think you guys can probably see what I'm doing with the brush a little bit better. And I've switched over now to dark sepia to ink her skin. This is where using colored line arts can really shine. If we were to use just black line art, kind of like how I talked about in the pumpkin tutorial that utilized similar materials, if we use just black line art, it has a tendency to kind of deaden the art because it creates this black outline. Whereas using colored line art, like we're doing today, colored line arts kind of add a liveliness and they don't distract the viewer as much. So since Naomi has darker skin, we're using a darker lining color. We're using sepia. Since she has black hair, we're using the black liner. And then Kara is light-skinned, and I hadn't yet decided what colors I wanted her outfit to be, so I just inked her with sanguine with the thought that I could re-ink her if I changed my mind. Now for Naomi's eyes, she has hazel eyes, so they're like blue-green hazel. And I used a dark indigo color to ink her eyes. And since I hadn't yet decided what color I wanted her clothes to be, I'm inking those with dark sepia as well. And since this is an illustration that I'm going to color, I'm using mixed media for this, I'm not really adding a lot of detail to the line work. I'm going to rely on the color to carry a lot of my detail. Alright, so now that the piece has been inked, I'm going to allow the pigments to cure to the paper for about an hour, and then I'm going to come back to it. If you guys enjoy the work that I do here on this channel, if you enjoy these sort of tutorials and reviews, if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. Actually, I decided to go back in and ink her hair darker using, gosh, it might be nougat. I'm so sorry, I don't know the exact color, since Kara has darker red-brown hair. And then after this, I'm going to let it cure for an hour. And if you guys really, really enjoy what I do and you want to help me make more of it, one of the best ways you can do that is to join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup, or to share these tutorials and these reviews on social media and tag me at natosoup, N-A-T-T-O-S-O-U-P. So we are switching now to our Durer watercolor markers, and I'm going to handle these watercolor markers in a variety of ways in this tutorial. So we're using ultramarine blue for the tops of her eyes, and for this tutorial I'm working with the 10 color set. So I'm working with a fairly limited number of colors, but that just means we have more room to get mixed media with these. So I used number 120. They're ultramarine for the tops of her eyes. And as you guys can see, I am directly applying number 125 to her shirt. And what's cool about Faber-Castell products, particularly their artist grade products, so like Polychromos, the Albrecht Dürer line, Pip Pins, is that not only do they have color names, which are fairly useful, but more descriptive than anything else, but they have color numbers, and these color numbers can be used to match colors from product to product. So a 125 in the Albrecht Dürer markers is going to be a 125 in Polychromos, and it's going to be a 125 in Pip Pins, and it's going to be a 125 in the Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers. So this makes matching colors and mixed media work much easier. Alright, so I blended our 125 out to get a smoother application of color. Now I'm applying some 125 to my non-porous craft mat. You guys can also use a ceramic plate or a piece of scrap plastic. And I'm applying it to Naomi's lips, nose, cheeks, and above her eyelids, and blending that out a little bit. Since Naomi is has a darker skin tone, I found that it's really helpful to apply my blush colors and my shading colors first, then apply her skin tones, rather than trying to do light, delicate washes of blushes on top of heavy layers of color. So next I've applied number 170, which is kind of a May green color. I'm blending it out with a little bit of water. And I'm going to dab in some 110. Oh, never mind. I'm using 110 to color in the straps on her tank top. And I'm blend that out with some water as well. I'm also going to apply some of that 110 wet into the tops of Naomi's eyes. This is going to diffuse out. So, since at the time I didn't have any good skin tones in the Durer watercolor marker line, I'm applying a Pip Pin big brush to my craft mat after cleaning it out or cleaning it off, and I'm going to paint that on for Kara's skin. And Pip Pins are cool because they can be treated like watercolor while they're still wet, so you can apply them to a non-porous surface as we did here and then paint it on, and you can paint delicate layers. In this way you can build up color, or you can apply it directly. So both the Durer watercolor markers and Pip Pins are India ink based. That's one of the reasons why all these colors match so well. The Pip Pins, once they dry out, they're going to be non-water soluble. This means you're not going to be able to reactivate them with water. Whereas the Durer watercolor markers are going to remain slightly water soluble, the same way that regular watercolors are slightly water soluble. So for Naomi's first layer of skin, I applied number 175, which is dark sepia, to my craft mat, added a lot of water, and then started painting in her skin tone, leaving a bit of rim lighting so that you guys can still see the tone tan of the paper. Now, one of the things I really like about painting on tone tan, especially for people with darker skin tones, is we're not fighting the white of the paper. You don't have to build up the color as much. You don't have to do 20 layers because you have this beautiful tone paper that provides a base color. Now I want to caveat to you guys that the night I was painting this illustration, it was extremely wet and gross. It's Nashville fall right now, and it's just rainy every day. So I do get some cauliflower drying, and I did have some problems with dry times, and I did have some problems with pigment movement. And this is not the fault of the paper, and it's not the fault of the markers, because I've been using these products pretty consistently for the past week on days that had better weather than the night I painted this. It's entirely due to the fact that we're painting on a cellulose paper. This mixed media paper is a cellulose-based paper on a wet night. And the thing about cellulose papers is, unlike cotton rag papers, where the pigments will soak into the paper surface and kind of adhere to the fibers inside, watercolors, wet media will sit on the surface of cellulose papers and evaporate into the atmosphere, which is why they sometimes dry faster than cotton rag papers, especially on particularly dry days. The problem with this is, as you do more layers, it never soaks into the paper. It just kind of sits on top, and it can be very easy to reactivate. Now, I'm not bringing this up to complaining, you guys. I use both cellulose-based papers and I use cotton rag papers all the time. I use them for different things. I'm bringing this up because I think understanding how your materials work is going to allow you to make good choices when you're buying materials. It's going to allow you to make good choices when you're selecting materials for different projects. And it's going to help you know how to handle your materials and get the best out of your materials. So I also applied 175 to Naomi's hair as well. She has black hair, and I want to build up a mid-tone to serve as my lightest point. So once those two layers dried, I'm starting to block in shadows, and you guys can still see I'm working by applying my color to my non-porous craft mat and then painting it onto the paper. And you guys can also see how I really didn't have to do a lot of color development because we're working with this tone tan paper. Then when that dried, I went in for a straight application with 175. And I'm going to blend that out with water. So I'm basically applying it to the shadows anywhere I might want darker colors and darker color saturation. So something else that's cool about the Durer watercolor markers is that they do have fiber nibs. They say they're brush nibs. They are brush nibs, but they're brush fiber nibs. However, they're very gentle fiber nibs. They're not the scratchy kind of fiber nibs, and they're not the kind of fiber nibs that are going to turn to mush as you use them. I've been using the same 10 set pretty consistently. In fact, all during hands-on creativity, we let little kids play with these because they're non-toxic since they're India ink based. And those little kids were not gentle with my markers, but you know what? My markers held up. I didn't see any damage that couldn't be fixed. I didn't see any fraying. I didn't see any splitting. Even when this one little girl colored a black cat, all black, and then she did the yellow eyes, and y'all know, like yellow on top of black is like the kiss of death for the yellow marker. I was able to get all of the black out of the marker. So these markers are actually incredibly tough. I am really impressed by how these markers perform. I think these could be a perfect marker for people who are maybe interested in getting into watercolor, but they came from the marker background, and they want to be able to use something that's kind of like the best of both worlds. It could be good for younger artists. It could be good for parents who want to share art and artist-grade materials with their kids, but are worried about toxicity issues. They could be good for, like I was, where I was a very art-interested teenager, and I wanted all of my presents to be nice art supplies, and my family didn't really know what to buy for me. This could be a great present like that. All right, so you guys can see I'm blending out my number 175 using a wet brush. This is where I really started getting the cauliflowering, because at this point the paper had been saturated, so it dries kind of unevenly. If I had had the time, I would have stepped away and let it dry completely for an hour before attempting this, but I was working on creating samples for hands-on creativity, so I had a bit of a time crunch. I also want to point out that these markers were sent to me by Faber-Castell to help me prepare for hands-on creativity, to help me create pieces like this one, but I was not paid for this tutorial. I was not requested to create this tutorial. This was done of my own volition, and all opinions are my own opinions. They did not pay me for a sponsored review or anything like that. They just provided the materials and asked me to represent the materials at Hands-On Creativity. So these are my own opinions. So now I'm applying a little bit of our phthalo blue, so 110, to the background, and I'm blending it out with a little bit of water. And I chose 110 because it's a bit of a contrast color to the tone tan of the paper. So that's going to make Kara and Naomi pop a little bit more. It's also kind of a contrasty color to the skin tones that we're using, which is going to help them pop more as well. And of course I clean up my surface and I add some more dark sepia to help me continue to build up and develop my colors and my shadows. So I think you guys can probably see what I was talking about when I said it starts to cauliflower a little bit on Naomi, because I drew her larger since she's the human and Kara's the Lilliputian. That cauliflowering actually looks stylistic in the finished piece. It adds visual interest because there's a lot of skin to cover. It's not necessarily super distracting, but this is something you're going to want to be aware of, and you may want to control it. There's some instances where cauliflowering like that looks good. There's some instances where it could ruin the whole piece. So understanding what causes it and how you can prevent it are important. So now I'm adding a little bit of the 125 to the hair bobbles in her hair, and I'm going to blend that out with a little bit of water. And now I'm directly applying 125 to her lips, to her cheeks, to the inside of her ear. Now, this is the 10 color set. So I only received 10 colors. And as with any 10 color set, so now I'm applying the 110 to the tops of her eyes and blending that out with 170 a little bit and adding more 125 to her hair bobbles and to her cheeks. So with any 10 color set, you're going to receive a lot of basic colors. This is not like a painting people kind of set. This isn't a skin tone or a portrait set. It's just a basic 10 color set. So you receive a yellow, an orange, a red, which is kind of like an orangey red, one pink, two blues, an ultramarine and a phthalo type blue, two greens, a viridian type green, and a warmer sort of sap green, dark sepia, which really looks like Van Dyke brown, and then black. So you really have to make the most of the colors that you receive when you have a 10-piece set, when you have a 10 color set. And you don't really receive a lot of skin tones. I was happy that the dark sepia works really, really well for Naomi's skin tone. But for Kara, as you saw, I went in and used a Pip Pin big brush to paint her skin tone. Now, the Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers, they come in a 30 color range. There's a couple of skin tone-esque colors. There's a beige red. There's a, which you guys will see in another video, there's like an Indian red, and then there's another reddish brown color. But in general, I would really like to see, if these markers do well, if people enjoy these markers, I would like to see Albrecht Dürer release a few more skin tones and like skin tone friendly colors. So like an alizarin crimson would be nice. All right, so I am now using, well, okay, so I was going to use a Pip Pin big brush in like medium flesh to do another layer on our lips, but it actually went fluoro on top of the colors I'd put down. So instead I'm using kind of a nice dark mulberry color. I can tell you guys what that color is in just a second by the color name. So you guys can see that these are all kind of interusable. And that is magenta number 133. And I'm also using a warm gray to start Naomi's hair. So as I mentioned earlier in the tutorial, Naomi has black hair, and when I'm painting black hair, like when I'm painting Pancake, her pet black kitten, I like to build up the color. So I don't just go straight in with black because that can feel very dead, especially if I'm working in color. I build up using like 3 or 4 colors to get to black, because dark colored objects, when you light them, they usually have a bit of a gradient in terms of color, and I want to be able to reflect that. So I'm using a dark warm gray Pip Pin big brush to fill in her hair. Now this is going to be non-water soluble, but I'm okay with that because I can paint on top of it and it's not going to turn to mud. So when you use these products interchangeably, you can use them for their different properties and build up different effects. So my goal is to apply this warm dark gray India ink and then go over it with the water soluble black watercolor marker and wash that black out, so we still get the really strong, really tight shinies that I've applied to her hair that you guys can see I'm putting in, but you also get kind of a wash of black, which you guys will see in a minute. So something I want to point out here is that if you use Pip Pins on top of your watercolor markers, they do start to get kind of gunky and jam up. You can clean them out, but I thought my marker was going dry at first. It's not going dry, it's just getting gunked up with the pigment. So now I'm going to go over it with number 199. That is their black marker. And I'm still applying it in like kind of bouncy, sprouncy strokes. I'm letting the marker do a lot of the work. But I am going to wash it out with clean water, and you guys will see why, hopefully in a little bit. So I'm using clean water to wash out some of the black, to move some of that black pigment around, and to kind of create a gradient so that our highlights towards the back aren't as strong as our highlights to the front, but you can still see those under marks. So now I'm going to use a dark purple Pip Pin, since I don't have any dark purples in the 10 color set, to begin blocking in the shadows on Naomi's skin. And it's really fortunate that I got kind of obsessed with Pip Pins a couple years ago, because this left me with a lot of material that I could use for these illustrations. So I am also blending out the Pip Pin just a little bit with some water, particularly on her nose and her eyelids. Remember, I mentioned earlier in the tutorial that if you catch Pip Pins while they're still wet, you can blend them out. So now I'm applying it to my non-porous craft mat and using this to paint in the shadows on her magenta shirt, as well as the shadows on her lips, and sort of better define the shadows on her eyelids. So Naomi is nearly done. It's time to get some work done on Kara. So I apply a medium flesh tint Pip Pin to my non-porous craft sheet, and I use that to paint the blush on Kara's cheeks and lips, as well as underneath her chin and the palms of her hands and the tips of her fingers. And I'm using a really floppy squirrel brush for this. I would not recommend using a really floppy squirrel brush for this, but it's what I happen to grab. While I wait for that to dry, I'm just kind of tweaking some things on Naomi, adding a little bit more magenta or deep pink to her lips, adding some purple to her little hair bobbles. I used Sanguine to color in Kara's eyes, and now I'm using it to block in her hair. So this is almost the same color as what we used to ink her. I said Sanguine, but it's actually, no, it is Sanguine, number 188. I was thinking it was terracotta for a minute. It's what happens when we go by what our eyes tell us. And I'm also using number 121 to fill in the red on her mouth. Now, I wanted to build up more color with her hair. So I mentioned earlier that dark sepia, when you use the brush and you wash it out, looks more like Van Dyke brown. So I'm using that to help build up some of the color in her hair. Now, since I'm painting specific characters from my specific comic, I'm allowing their existing colors to kind of influence the color choices that I'm making for this illustration. And then I'm washing that Van Dyke brown out a little bit, kind of expanding it out a bit. And I do apologize that my head keeps getting into the shot. I feel like I apologize for this a lot. Alright, so I am coloring in her pants with Earth Green, number 172. Now for the far legging, I colored it all in. For the nearer one, I'm blending it out with a little bit of water so that they're not exactly the same tone, and so that we're also taking advantage of our tone tan paper as a mid-tone. Then I'm going back into her hair with what looks like walnut brown. Let me check. Yep, walnut brown, number 177. And you guys can see that Pip Pins, the Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers, and then Pip Pins again, they can be layered over and over and over again to build up the kind of color that you want, as long as the product is dry. You can probably do it when it's wet too, but I will not vouch for it while it's still wet. And then I am coloring in her boots using Caput Mortuum 169. You know, Caput Mortuum used to be made a long time ago, and this is really terrible, but it used to be made from like mummies that had been ground up. And it was this really beautiful color, but obviously that is 100% disrespectful and not ethical. So they have found good substitutes for that. So I wanted her to have a white shirt. So I'm coloring it in with light indigo, number 220, which is a really, really light blue color. And now I'm adding another layer of Caput Mortuum to her boots. And you guys can see how the sanguine line art just really stands out. We're going to take care of that in a minute. And then I'm going back over her pants with Earth Green 172, as well as her shirt again with light indigo. So at this point, we're really starting to develop the colors now that we've established the colors. And for some areas, I'm going back in with 199. That's our black Albrecht Dürer watercolor marker, just to kind of better define. Oh no, actually, I lied to you. It's $1.99, but it's in a Pip Pin big brush to better define some of the shadows in her hair. And rumor has it that these are being discontinued. If you guys know anything, can link me to anything that talks about that, please do. I really do like them, but I understand that for Pip Pins, perhaps I am not Faber's the customer that they had in mind. I know they've been really going towards brush lettering and letterers and bullet journal people a lot lately, whereas, you know, cartoony style illustrators, not so much. So maybe we're just not buying enough of the product to make it worth continuing. Which is why, if you guys love a product, you should go out of your way to let the manufacturers know so that they have a reason for continuing it. Just like if you love a YouTuber, you should let them know so that they have a reason for continuing their videos. And it looks like I'm using a dark sepia big brush to better define some of the shadows on Naomi's skin. So I wasn't lying when I told you guys this is real. We're getting real mixed media up in here today. Now I'm just kind of relining things to better define the outlines a bit, since the outlines do provide definition and shadow. And I'm also relining some of the things on Kara as well for the same reason. So I found the sanguine line art was a little bit distracting. So I'm using, let's say, for her on her pants, I'm actually using cobalt green to kind of re-ink her pants and provide a line art that isn't so distracting. Alright, so I'm going to allow this to fully dry, and then we're going to add in some additional details using Faber-Castell's beautiful Polychromos color pencils. So I'm starting by kind of redefining my whites using a white Polychromos, and my camera is having a hard time with the white of the paper and the tone tan paper, so I do apologize for that. And I'm using that white paper as it's a blotter. It's to protect my illustration from my hand and from smearing. So I'm just using the white Polychromos to add some highlights back in. Since when we're working on a tone paper, adding white is a huge part of how you get that nice color pop, because we don't have the white of the paper that's distracting the viewer. It's just the white of whatever we add on. I'm also using walnut Polychromos just to kind of refine some of the planes on Naomi's face and to better define some of the details. As well as a middle blue to add some shadows to our white object, so the tops of Naomi's eyes as well as Kara's shirt and the tops of her eyes. And a darker helio blue reddish to add some more blue to Naomi's eyes, since she has hazel eyes. So basically, I'm just using these polychromos pencils to better define things, to refine things. Like I'm adding some additional red to her blush, to her lips. I'm refining the purple shadows and adding a little bit more purple / magenta. I use some white to pull in the highlights, just things like that. Having the ability to work mixed media is fantastic because you really can utilize the best aspects of each material to achieve the look you want. And I know that when we're talking about traditional lines of thought, traditional schools of thought in terms of like watercolor, for example, there are some watercolor artists who believe that you shouldn't use watercolor markers and that you shouldn't use watercolor pencils and that you shouldn't use white gouache and you should only use watercolors if you're doing a watercolor piece, that anything else is no longer watercolor. But I think by going mixed media, like we're adding a bit of a white halo around Naomi and Kara, I think by going mixed media, you have so many more options and it allows you to better achieve what you have in mind. So I applied some of the white opaque Pip Pin, and that's only available to my knowledge in the big brush. I'd love it, love it, love it, love it if they did it in the watercolor marker and if they did it in one of the smaller brushes. I'm applying it to my craft mat and using some clean water to apply a light white wash so I can add further white details like in the background. Also, mixed media is just fun. It's playing. It's playing with all the best toys together. I mean, when you were a kid, did anybody tell you you couldn't mix G.I. Joes with Barbie dolls with Legos? I mean, I'm sure there were people who did that, but those are people who clearly did not know how to have fun, right? So for me, getting mixed media is fun. And it's something I don't get to do too often when I'm doing my field test reviews because there's a real push for me to review the product as it is and not supplement it too much. And that's so that I can give the best review that I possibly can. But I love playing with mixed media, and when I'm making art for myself, I love doing mixed media art. So you guys see I'm re-inking just a little bit, refining her jawline, refining the inks on her shirt, just kind of redefining and adding some contrast back in. Another awesome thing though about mixed media is you don't have to have a lot of any one product to be able to create a beautiful piece of art. We used 10 colors, not even 10 colors, 10 of the Albrecht Dürer watercolors. We used a small handful of polychromos colors. We used a small handful of Pip Pin, but we were able to achieve a really cute finished piece that feels cohesive. It doesn't feel like, oh, we used watercolor on one half and Pip Pins on the other half. Because like, as I think about it, we mostly just used Pip Pins on Kara and we mostly used the Albrecht Dürer watercolor pencils on Naomi. But they feel like they go together. So mixed media, when it's done well, it works as a cohesive whole. So now I'm going back in to our blue outline and I'm just adding some helio blue reddish just to kind of build up that blue a little bit more and make them pop from the page a little bit more. And I have to say, by the time I add my white highlights to a piece, that's when the piece really starts to come alive, is when we add the specular highlights to the eyes, the shinies, that it really starts to come to life. So I had a blast creating this piece. I had a blast tabling at Hands on Creativity and getting to meet so many of you guys. It really touched my heart that you guys came out to say hi. Please don't ever feel afraid to come talk to me at any show. It's always a pleasure and it really fills my heart to get to meet y'all. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.